Hello friends of the electrified charging fun and welcome to the Wild West of charging. Because out there, things are often anything but refined. Imagine this, you're driving your EV on a long trip. You arrive at a charging station and suddenly realize the driver next to you is paying half the price for the very same electricity, at the very same plug, at the very same time. No extra services, no golden connector, just electricity and still completely different prices. Today, it's not about whether you should pick provider A or B, it's about the bigger picture. Why do you pay totally different prices for the same electricity? Who makes money in the background, often without you noticing? Why does a charging site really cost that much money? And what is a fair price? Why do new rules like AFIR only help to a limited extent, and who is actually fighting for us, the customer, in this market? Many of you have asked me over and over again if I and when I will finally say something about charging tariffs, price jungle and costs. This here is my answer. And that's why everything you hear in this video is my personal assessment, interpretation and opinion, based on my research and my experiences. I do not claim absolute truth or accuracy. I make mistakes and my interpretations, conclusions and information may be wrong. Professionally, I've spent over 15 years building digital business models from scratch up to the market as a product manager and product owner in various industries. Powerful systems that make a lot of money and scale well, but are not always in the best interest of the end customer. And I see the same patterns here again. So let's dive into the structure behind the prices. The problem is big, bigger than you might think. A market sounds simple at first. Some want something, others have something, they meet, they trade, and that's it. So far, so easy. With EV charging, however, things are more complicated because several players are involved and each one has their own interests. Try to memorize the abbreviations as I will use them throughout the video. There is the CPOs, charging point operators. They build and operate the charging infrastructure. What matters most to them is that the stations run reliably, uptime, and that they are used, utilization. Then we've got the EMPs, electric mobility providers, often also called EMSPs. They provide the apps or charging cards and position themselves between the customer and the CPO. They make money on both sides, through customer usage and through terms with operators. On the terminology, you often read MSP or EMSPs, but more often electric mobility provider EMP is used, therefore I will use it in this video as well. Next up is someone you might not know, the CPMS, the Charging Point Management Systems Provider. Basically software providers for CPOs, for control, billing and monitoring of charging points. But some also act as aggregators. They bundle charging points from different operators and negotiate directly with EMPs. This creates yet another layer between the CPO and the EMP, an extra link that makes the market even more complex. And then we've got the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, or the car manufacturers. They often run their own EMPs, like Volkswagen with Elli. Their goal is less about fair electricity price and more about keeping customers locked in their ecosystem, at least that's my point of view. There are many more players in that market, like energy utilities, oil companies, and many of them play a lot of roles, a CPO and an EMP, and they are not only these mixed forms, there are so many possible mixes. The roles overlap and that blurs the interests even further. But to understand the system, it's enough to look at the core group described in this chapter. And it is precisely this interplay, who cooperates with whom, who competes with whom, that makes today's charging market so complex. For us as customers, it often remains hard to understand why a certain price comes about. Electricity is, at its core, a commodity, a standardized good that is interchangeable. Of course, electricity can be distinguished by its source, coal, wind, solar. But once it's in the grid, it can no longer be separated. An electron is an electron, no matter which line or charging station it flows through. It's the same with gasoline. A liter of regular from station A is the same as from station B, additives or not. In the end, it's interchangeable. Prices for gasoline did fluctuate, but the difference between two stations were usually 1 or 2 cents per liter. 50 liters at 180 versus 178, that's only about €1 difference per full tank. With EV charging, it's completely different. We are not talking about a few cents, but massive gaps. At one station, a kilowatt hour is 39 cents, at the next 89. For 50 kilowatt hours, that's a full €20 difference. for exactly the same product at the same time at the same location. And it even gets more absurd. You don't even have to move to the next station. This can happen at the very same charger. That's the core of the absurdity. We buy electricity, a commodity with a uniform market price, and yet we pay completely different rates. Think about a gas station. Prices are always displayed on the mast, but that display is mainly orientation. Is the general market price trending higher or lower, not whether station A or B is fundamentally different? And here's the problem. The price display at the charging station comes too late, because this isn't about a general market check like at a gas station. Prices are not uniform, they are wildly different. If you only find out at the charger that it's twice as expensive, you can hardly react anymore. Price transparency therefore has to happen before the decision, not when you're already at the plug. Of course, there are price differences that are perfectly understandable. Take water, scarce in the desert, abundant by a freshwater lake, a matter of availability. Gas stations, fuel more expensive on the highway than in town, better location, more convenience. Or fuel grades, regular cheaper than premium because of octane differences. All of this makes sense because the environment, service or quality is different. With charging, it's often different. Imagine walking into the same store, standing at the same shelf. There's a bottle of water. It never changes, brand, content, all the same. Now here's the absurd part. The price you pay depends on which salesperson you ask where to find that bottle. One says €1, the other says 3 for the exact same bottle. That's what happens in charging today. Different providers, the same infrastructure, the same product, different prices, with no real added value, and often without you even having the chance to know which price is the best, or at least fair. In a supermarket, it's simple. The product shows the price, and that's the price for everyone. No matter who checks you out at the register, you know exactly what you pay. At a charging station, it's different. There, if anything, you only see the operator's price. But most of us charge through an EMP via an app or charging card. Their prices aren't displayed at the station. They are hidden in the apps and tariff models. The result? For the very same electricity at the very same station, suddenly many different prices. But why? The reason is the EMP, which we've already met. They negotiate terms with CPOs, for example, volume discounts for certain amounts of electricity. As a customer, you probably assume these discounts are passed on to you. In practice, it's often impossible to tell. You don't know if you're getting the benefit or not. In business terms, this is called information asymmetry. The provider knows more than the customer and can use that knowledge to capture margin. In my view, EMPs don't just use their volume to secure better conditions, they can also use it to exert pressure on operators. With small and medium-sized CPOs, those who do not cooperate risk losing visibility and getting kicked out of the app. And with larger CPOs, if they resist, an EMP might set end customer prices so high that charging points appear unattractive to the user. Well, that's my personal interpretation, but it shows how much visibility and price setting power can lie in the hand of an EMP. And that's exactly what makes the market so opaque for customers. We already know this pattern from the hotel and travel industry. There too, an extra player inserted itself between provider and customer. The platform. It bundles, compares, and creates visibility, and takes a cut. Not out of charity, but because it's a highly lucrative business model. This lack of clarity creates room for maneuver. On the one hand, EMPs can lower their purchase prices, while on the other end customers may still face higher prices. The effect is that money is being made on both sides, at the expense of transparency. And why does every EMP have its own app? Because it's about much more than billing. A charging card gives you only limited data. An app delivers full profiles. When, where and how often do you charge, which routes do you take, which providers you prefer. With route planners, even where you're heading and what car you are using, more data means more influence. Whoever owns the app controls the customer access. And with that influence, they negotiate discounts with CPOs and prices with you. Of course, EMPs advertise supposed benefits. One app for all charging points, simple payment, always the best rates. But let's look closer. Coverage, never truly all charging points. And payment, not simpler, just different. You still need an account, you still have terms and conditions and payment methods. So, best rates, often misleading. Instead of transparency, you get dynamic pricing, complicated subscription models, and surcharges for all kinds of things. In short, what's marketed as added value is often just a sales pitch. Real value would be transparency, simple choices, and clear prices. But in my opinion, very few EMPs actually deliver that. Let's take a closer look at the CPMS, the Charging Point Management Systems. In principle, those providers are supposed to be pure software providers, giving CPO the tools for monitoring, control, billing, and reporting. Without such systems, operating many charging points would hardly be possible. But some providers go further. They don't just act as software partners, but also as aggregators. That means they bundle charging points from different CPOs. They negotiate packages with EMPs on conditions. They position themselves as a distant layer between CPO and EMP. The chain shifts to CPO, CPMS, EMP, and then customer. Why is this problematic? Well, for the CPO, they give away not only data but also bargaining power to a system that was supposed to be just a service provider. For an EMP, they no longer negotiate directly with the operators, but with an additional middleman. And for us customers, each extra layer can add costs and reduce transparency. My personal interpretation of this: CPMS should really make money with software, SaaS models, so software as a service, and licenses. But some seem to have found an easier way, not just providing software, but also taking a cut from the reselling of electricity. This creates a quiet, often invisible, but highly influential next or second middle layer in the market. Let's look inside the car, specifically the Škoda Enyaq or the Elroq, both built by Škoda, so belong to the Volkswagen Group, which means Ellie as an EMP is effectively sitting right there in the cockpit. In Škoda's case, it's called Power Pass. In the vehicle, you can switch the Power Pass on or off as a charging provider. But what does it actually mean when you switch it off? Which data source does the navigation then rely on? Map providers, aggregators, CPO feeds? Which filters remain active in the background? Reliability, partner networks, internal scores? What does all chargers really mean? In short, we don't know. It's written nowhere. Even deactivating feels like a switch without a manual, a non-transparent system. Now that raises a question, at least to me. Why does the car choose this specific charger in the route planning? At many sites, multiple CPOs are located right next to each other, sometimes just a few meters. Range or distance can't be the reason why the navigation system systematically guides you to provider A instead of B. That suggests it's not pure coincidence. The selection is part of a business setup. Which data sources are considered, which partnerships exist, which preferences are built into the algorithm. All of this remains opaque for the user. Why OEMs might avoid transparency can, in my opinion, have several reasons. Customer lock-in and monetization is one. The OEM wants to keep you in its own ecosystem with accounts, subscription, margins, and data. And data advantage is the next one. Charging through the OEM app provides driving profiles, willingness to pay, and route patterns. And they give them negotiation power. Direct customer access strengthens the position against CPOs and third-party EMPs. In the short term, defaults can steer behavior. In the long term, it creates dissatisfaction. And that's exactly what we see. According to a study by Uscale, OEM and EMPs from OEMs are losing significant market share. In my comments, emails, and forum discussions, I hear the same points again and again. Price too high, no transparency, unclear selection. PowerPass used to be attractive, cheap, convenient, and simple, but now is more complex and less transparent. The original advantage is gone. This suggests there was a heavy subsidization in the early years, aiming at boosting EV sales within the Volkswagen Group. But convenience has limits. It only works as long as prices and fairness remain reasonable. Once the boundary is crossed, behaviors shift. Customers accept the use of external apps. Some even give up built-in convenience features if they push them towards overpriced tariffs. Instead, they turn to third-party providers, more accounts, more planning, more effort. This shows OEMs rely on lock-in, but the market already provides that convenience alone isn't enough if the prices seem unfair. Most long-distance charging sessions are planned. That means transparency has to come before in the route planning. Prices, cost forecast, utilization, and detours needs to be visible in the navigation. The other option would be to align all prices at the charging stations, like with gasoline. But that cannot be the goal, because it would eliminate advantages that some providers achieve through better locations, services or concepts, and that would stifle competition. Now let's take a closer look at the CPOs, the charging point operators. They are often seen as the good guys because they build the infrastructure and take the investment risk. But from my perspective, they are not without problems. From the very beginning, many CPOs charged high prices. Their justification was obvious: expensive hardware, costly grid connections. In the short term, this makes business sense, but it had a side effect. The higher the price, the fewer drivers used the station. The lower utilization, the more prices had to rise to cover costs. A classic vicious cycle. Low utilization, high prices, even lower utilization. And we should not forget, even early on, CPOs could probably set such high prices because they assumed OEMs would subsidize the difference for their customers. In my view, this is what happens. Many drivers charge for free for a year or at 30 or 35 cents per kilowatt hour, while operators invoiced much higher rates. For customers, this was attractive. For CPOs, this was convenient, but for the market, it was a dangerous signal. Because this created the illusion that even higher prices were sustainable. It led to an expansion where locations were built that make little economic sense. Today we see the result. Without OEM subsidized charging prices, everything comes down to utilization and site quality. We'll look at that in more detail later. High prices also attract new players. Not only more CPOs wanting a piece of the pie, but especially EMPs. Where margins are visible, intermediaries arrive. EMPs seized theirs as an opportunity. They inserted themselves between customers and CPOs, demanded discounts and added their own markups. In my opinion, that was one of the major mistakes. By setting inflated prices, CPOs made the EMPs strong in the first place. Customers saw the high-end ad hoc prices and moved to EMPs, especially OEM-affiliated ones that offered those subsidized tariffs. At the same time, EMPs gave CPOs something that looked like the lifeline: purchase volume. We'll bring you customers, we'll guarantee you utilization. And that promise wasn't empty. EMPs could back it up with data, with your data. Every charging session, every route, every profile flowed into their system. That gave EMPs a powerful lever to influence CPOs in negotiations. At the same time, many CPOs also found ways to protect their position. In roaming, the operator's ad hoc price is usually the baseline for all transactions. Those who set it high automatically gain stronger position against smaller EMPs. And when CPOs also act as EMPs themselves, they can give their own customers better rates than an external provider. The result? Outsiders pay more, insiders pay less at the same charging point. And this pattern is not new. In other industries, platforms have already shifted the rules of the game. How markets evolve when supply, demand and transparency fall out of balance, that's what we will look at in the next chapter. At first glance, it should be simple. More charging stations, more competition, lower prices. That's straight out of the economics textbook. But with charging, the opposite happens. The number of fast chargers is growing rapidly, yet prices remain high. Why? This contradicts classical market logic. More supply, stable or falling demand, prices should drop, even with the high fixed costs a charging site generates. I'll come to that back later. In a transparent market with a homogeneous product, a commodity, competition would now take hold. Providers would undercut each other until the price came close to variable costs, those that only arise when the charger is used. But with EV charging, several mechanisms block exactly this price competition. There are surge and switching costs. Prices aren't visible as gasoline on a roadside mast. Often you only find out at the charger and then it's too late to switch. Even this small hurdle allows big price differences. Charge power of EMPs is another problem because who controls the app or charging card decides which stations you see and which prices. It's not the price that decides, but the order shown in the app or navigation. And we've got the local differentiation. Charging points aren't fully interchangeable. A 1 kilometer detour or an extra minute, and many drivers stick with a more expensive option. And then there are the OEM defaults. Many cars route you by default through the OEM's own EMP. Price comparisons are missing. Artificial preferences are created. Examples like Norway or Denmark, by the way, show that it can be different. Strong demand, stable utilization and real competition. There, fixed costs per kilowatt hour fall and competition prevents prices from spiraling. The issue isn't the product, electricity, but the market conditions. But does anyone benefit from the current situation? Well, in my point of view, yes, mainly the intermediaries. In a non-transparent market, they can present themselves as guides through the jungle, squeeze discounts from one side and at the same time add markups for the customer. For them, today's situation is ideal. Little transparency, high margins, the golden age of platform business. More charging stations should, in theory, push prices down. But in charging, we don't see a classical market. What matters isn't the number of stations, but who is visible and what information the customer gets. Limited visibility creates artificial scarcity, even if enough charging points would exist. Missing price transparency makes true competition nearly impossible. In the end, customers overpay. CPOs come under pressure and intermediaries profit. And here lies the real difference. While CPOs carry heavy investments and most are running at a loss, no operator network is consistently profitable today, EMPs have a much lighter cost structure. They don't run their own chargers but live off margins, markups and data. Some are probably already profitable. Others deliberately focus on growth and dominance, even if it means short-term losses. The real goal? Controlling customer access, because whoever sits between the car and the charging station ultimately decides how money is distributed in the market. In my view, that is the key point. As long as transparency is missing, the line between cost, margin and manipulation is blurred. The real question is, what is a fair price and how can it be justified? Let's take a look at a concrete price model. This example comes from the Ionity website valid for Germany. In my view, Ionity shows that prices are determined less by the pure cost of electricity and more by channels and customer behavior. Ad hoc, it's 75 cents, with the app 70 cents, two subscription models 5.99 with 49 cents a kilowatt hour and 11.99 with 39 cents a kilowatt hour. At first glance, this looks like a simple tiered structure, but there's more behind it, I think. App usage is rewarded because it reduces payment risks. A credit card stored in the app is more secure than one used at the terminal. 3D Secure applies. The app also delivers customer data and serves as a marketing funnel. Then the high ad hoc price acts as a steering mechanism in my point of view. If you don't use the app, you pay extra. And the subscription prices look psychologically attractive, but they are never as cheap in practice as advertised. We rarely recalculate subscription costs into the kilowatt hour price. We just see 39 or 49 cents. At 100 kilowatt hours per month, the real price is about 51 cents and at 200 kilowatt hours, 45 cents. In my view, subscriptions serve several functions more. There's an anchoring effect. Charging is given an added value, making later price adjustments easier to enforce. There's segmentation. Occasional users pay ad hoc. Frequent drivers end up in the app. And there's predictability. Small fixed contributions secure revenue, especially with low usage. And there's data capture. Only regular app users continuously deliver data for future business model. But why is this tiered model possible at all? AFIR requires roaming prices to be non-discriminatory, meaning they must not exceed the ad hoc price. But if an operator also acts as its own EMP, this obligation doesn't apply in the same way, at least from my interpretation. They sell to themselves and can implement pricing models that external providers are barred from. For me, this is an example of how regulation and market logic intersect, something I'll cover in more detail in the AFIR chapter. Elli, as an EMP, offered the same Ionity subscription prices in the Power Pass, but according to my knowledge, also include a possible 300 kilowatt hour per month limit in the terms and conditions. This is communicated as a soft limit. When it actually applies, in my view, not clearly defined. For me, this means cross-subsidization via other CPOs only works as long as usage volume remains capped. I suspect Elli does not have the same purchase conditions at Ionity as Ionity itself, and that the cap is therefore a safeguard against losses. But that's my personal interpretation, not confirmed information. So when we see that prices are not determined solely by competition or supply, but are heavily shaped by channels, behavior and psychology, one key question remains. What does it actually cost to operate a charging station? Without the basis, it's hard to judge whether prices of 90, 94 or 98 cents per kilowatt hour are justified, or whether it's more a case of market logic and margin play. And that's exactly what we will look at in the next chapter. Which prices are justified for fast charging? Or put differently, what does it actually cost to operate a charging station? In the end, it comes down to a simple equation. What does a site cost and how often is it available and used to recover those costs and make profit? Companies operate for profit. Anyone expecting fast charging to run at wholesale electricity prices is confusing market economy with wishful thinking. First, let's look at CAPEX, capital expenditure, the one-time investments for construction and grid connection. Well, a high-performance charging unit is 50,000 to 150,000 euros per unit, depending on equipment and power. The grid connection starts at around 100 euro per ampere, so around 50,000 euros for 500 amperes. Then civil works, foundation, cabling, installation, tens of thousands more. For a 300 kilowatt HPC charger with 2 charging points, this quickly adds up to 200 to 300,000 euro and usually depreciated over 10 years. So let's take the midpoint, 25,000 per year, 10 years, 250,000. On top of that comes the annual operating cost, the OPEX, operational expenditure. Maintenance and service, 1 to 3% of the investment, so 4,000 to 7,500 euros a year. Back-end billing, site lease, insurance, several thousands more. Then the fixed grid fees, independent of consumption based on the connection capacity, easily 5-digit amounts per year for large sites. So in total we are at 15 to 20,000 euros fixed OPEX per year, in addition to the depreciation. Then we have the variable cost per kilowatt hour, highly dependent on the country. For example, variable grid charges, highly region and network dependent, 5 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Electricity, on average about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Maybe short-term cheaper, but long-term supply contracts or green power certificates at 8 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Direct photovoltaic is possible, but at an HPC site rarely more than a small supplement. Now, uptime becomes also important. Even the best charger does not run permanently. Manufacturers quote 95 to 97%. Sounds like a small difference, but means full days of downtime per year. So it's more 345 days instead of 365. But theoretical values don't help. What matters are session duration and throughput. A charging point is time limited depending on how it is used. Let's take an average session of 30 minutes, some longer, some shorter. Let's take the energy per session, about 40 kilowatt hours, again an average. Reality is even lower. Take a typical 300 kilowatt unit with those 2 points. Theoretical maximum output, 7,200 kilowatt hours per day. With our numbers, well, it's more 3,650 kilowatt hours. That's only 50% utilization, and that is even utopian. A Monta white paper gives realistic utilization values for DC chargers in Europe per day and per point. An average charging site, 150 to 175 kilowatt hours. Good sites, 225. Top performers, about 300, and exceptional ones, up to 500 kilowatt hours a day. Our example has 2 points, so let's double the figures. An exceptional site, that's 1,000 kilowatt hours, so 14% utilization. An average size is under 5% utilization. Let's look at the annual energy sold at our site. Average, well, it would be roughly 120,000 kilowatt hours. Good, 155,000. Top, 207,000. And exceptional, 345,000 kilowatt hours a year. Now we can calculate the break-even kilowatt hour price where revenue cover costs. We assumed 45,000 euros per year in fixed cost. So the average site would be at 38 cents a kilowatt hour plus the variable part, so break even at 60 cents a kilowatt hour. The good side around 50, the top side around 45, and the exceptional side would be at the break even with around 35 cents a kilowatt hour. But keep in mind, the better the site, the higher the OPEX often is due to higher grid connection fees or more expensive leases. And the CPO still wants a margin on top. In an earlier chapter, we already saw that many sites are average or poor performers because wrong incentives were set at the beginning. And such sites will always exist if we want full HPC coverage. A high kilowatt-hour price is therefore rarely a sign of expensive electricity. It is almost always a sign of low utilization. Profitability depends not on the tariff, but on actual usage. And that leads to the next chapter, with ability and utilization as the keys to fair prices. We've now talked a lot about prices, business models, and costs. In the end, it all comes down to one thing: utilization. Utilization is the critical number. How many kilowatt hours flow through a charging point each day? High utilization pays off even at lower prices. Low utilization remains a loss-making business even at 80 cents a kilowatt hour. This is classic fixed cost regression. The more kilowatt hours run through the charger, the lower the cost per kilowatt hour. Utilization only happens through visibility and partly through location as well. The cheapest price means nothing if nobody can find the charger. The highest charging power is useless if the navigation system doesn't show it. The best site doesn't help if the app hides it. Visibility is the multiplier that determines whether a site gets used or not. In theory, the logic should be simple. Lower prices attract more demand. But in charging, this market logic is broken. EMPs prioritize their partner CPOs. OEMs route drivers by default through their own EMPs. CPOs try to win back visibility with their own apps or alliances. The result? Even a cheap provider is not automatically visible and therefore not automatically utilized. One might assume that as EV adoption rises, utilization would automatically increase. At the core, that is of course true. But at the same time, the charging network also expands, and utilization is distributed unevenly. Not every charging site gets its fair share. Nobody wants to wait. Nobody wants to take detours, and very few want to adapt to a specific provider. In the end, what matters is whether I can charge where I actually need it or not. We have talked about many roles of the charging market so far, but one important player is often overlooked. Not because it is unimportant, but because you only understand its significance when you look at the big picture: the energy suppliers and grid operators. Their position is particularly strong because they earn on several levels. Network operators achieve secure, regulated returns on their infrastructure, regardless of how high the utilization of a charger is. Electricity producers benefit from every additional kilowatt hour sold, regardless of the channel. They do not even have to participate directly in the charging market to profit from every charging session. In my view, companies that combine several roles will become very powerful. I am talking about vertically integrated utilities. They combine electricity generation, grid operation, charging infrastructure, and customer relations via their own EMPs, often supplemented by hardware business, energy management, or even own software. In my estimation, this structure provides them with double security. Losses in the charging business can be offset by profits from electricity sales or grid fees. At the same time as EMPs, they have direct customer access, data and billing sovereignty, and thus considerable market power. I suspect that many of these providers have built up their position with heavily subsidized tariffs. In my observation, low prices at the outset ensure reach, trust, and market share. Today, they can apply mechanisms that we have already discussed in other chapters, only more systematically and consistently. In my opinion, third-party CPOs are often barely visible in their own EMP networks or are only integrated on unattractive terms. Their own ad hoc prices set the framework for roaming, whilst cheaper tariffs apply internally. My impression is that visibility in their apps is deliberately controlled in order to keep customers in their own vertical ecosystem. The European unbundling principle, however, effectively stimulates that grid operators should not act as CPOs themselves, for example. Unbundling means the strict separation of the regulated grid operation from the free competitive business such as electricity generation or sales. In my observation, the major energy corporations have circumvented this obstacle by establishing subsidiaries. Formally, they are separate companies, but in reality, they are fully controlled corporate offspring. In my view, this could bring distinct practical advantages for the overall corporation. It doesn't just profit simultaneously from all the roles it occupies. Furthermore, it can be speculated that this enables corporate subsidiaries to prioritize grid connections for their own projects over those of the competition. It is important to note, though, this is pure speculation, as precisely this kind of conduct is supposedly prevented by the applicable regulation and strict compliance requirements. In contrast, pure CPOs have significantly less leeway. They cannot compensate for losses through other business areas, but must cover their costs directly through the utilization of the charging points. Their only leverage is their own funds, loans or investor money. This makes them more vulnerable, especially as long as there are not enough electric cars to ensure stable basic utilization. This is why CPOs cannot simply set up charging stations everywhere, no matter how many people would like to have them do this. Each location must be economically viable and at the same time demonstrate sufficient scalability. This is not an indictment, but an economic logic. The big years are not behind us, they are still ahead of us. And this is precisely where the crucial question arises: who will survive the current phase? If only a few large suppliers or integrated companies remain at the end, there's a risk of an oligopoly. We are already familiar with this form of in other areas, such as petrol stations. Prices there are often uniform, but not automatically fair. Petrol stations earn money not only from fuel, but also heavily rely on shops and services. Charging parks can hardly generate such additional revenue. This is why the classic petrol station model cannot be simply transferred. And in my opinion, standardized prices would not be a step forward, but would rather stifle competition and diversity. Without sufficient vehicles, or better utilization, the business model of many CPOs remains a loss-making venture. Ultimately, what counts is who can hold out financially and whether the market will still offer diversity afterwards or be dominated by a few large providers. This is precisely where regulation comes in, with the aim of creating transparency, preventing discrimination, and laying the foundations for a sustainable market. We will see whether this is successful or not in the next chapter. The good news first. With AFIR, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation of the EU, there have been clear rules for charging since 2024. The goal? Simpler, more transparent, more comparable. A step forward that many have long demanded. The less good news, data does not equal visibility, and this is exactly where the market remains vulnerable. What already applies since 2024 is ad hoc payment. Every new fast charging point above 50 kilowatts must be usable without a contract. And price display. Costs must be shown clearly before charging starts. At the charging point, the CPO's ad hoc price must be visible. But only this reference price is mandatory. The many EMP prices remain invisible, a core problem unsolved. And since April 2025, operators must provide their data openly in a machine-readable format. So location, plug type, power, price, availability. What will apply from April 2026 is the obligation to push data in the EU standard DATIX 2. So the static data we already talked about, and availability and outtakes, maintenance, a lot of data. That sounds like a breakthrough, but the real dynamics arise elsewhere. A core principle of AFIR is roaming prices must not be higher than the operator's ad hoc price. No hidden markups, no discrimination. That is the idea. Price differences are only allowed if the context changes, for example, different charging power, different plug types, or time-based fees to prevent blocking. Between EMP and end user, however, there must be no different surcharges for the exact same charging session. In my personal view, this can create problems for an CPO. The ad hoc price effectively sets the upper limit. In practice, large EMPs negotiate discounts far below that. In some cases, this could already fall below the variable costs of electricity and grid fees. The result? Every roaming charging session would become unprofitable for the CPO. This may also explain why some operators set their ad hoc prices as high as they do. Not necessarily because electricity is so expensive or because they want to refinance their infrastructure quickly, but also to protect themselves from aggressive discounts in the roaming business. That would make the often criticized 69 to 89 cents a kilowatt hour ad hoc prices plausible. They look excessive to the end customer, but economically they act as a shield of the CPO. Another point, company car drivers account for a significant share of charging at some operators. These customers are price insensitive. They do not pay themselves, but employers or fleet providers do. They charge almost exclusively with their EMP roaming. Thus, the largest volumes run over the most heavily discounted prices. In theory, this baseload should lower prices per kilowatt hour. In reality, however, it often leads to ad hoc prices staying higher while fleets remain profitable through roaming at this high cost. And there's a possible loophole that we increasingly see in the market. When a CPO also acts as EMP, it is effectively selling to itself. Whether the same rules apply as in the relationship with external EMPs depends on interpretation. This way, operators can keep ad hoc high and tie external roaming to it, and at the same time offer cheaper conditions in their own app or subscription. The result is a price gap. Outsiders pay more, own customers pay less, at the very same charging point. This is not explicitly prohibited by AFIR, but raises questions about market logic and non-discrimination. This background could also explain why initiatives like Spark Alliance have struggled. Cooperation between CPOs is possible, but offering exclusive end customer tariffs across partner networks could be considered discriminatory. Therefore, the tariffs of one operator usually do not automatically apply to the network of the other players. At least that's my point of view. And we've got further weaknesses of AFIR. The legacies. Many existing charging points are only partly covered, retrofit obligations are limited. A big gray zone, when a price difference is objectively justified or not, that remains open to interpretation. The enforcement depends on national authorities with very different levels of strictness. And at the end, the EMP margins which stay intransparent and are not visible. AFIR is a progress, but more of a technical framework than a real solution. It delivers more data, but not automatically fair prices or real choice. Transparency is a start, but the customer perspective remains decisive. Let's first take a brief look at the only provider that, in my assessment, has so far solved the problem most consistently from the customer's perspective, though within a closed system. That's Tesla. Closed here does not mean that only Teslas can charge there. The network is open to other vehicles as well. It is closed because, in my view, all roles are controlled by Tesla itself: OEM, EMP, CPO, CPMS and app operator. This creates, in my impression, an integrated user experience, high convenience, high reliability and often competitive prices. The key question for me is, how can we create something comparable in an open market with many players? In my opinion, the answer does not lie in more apps and more charging cards, but in transparency and simplicity directly in the car without all the additional complexity. From my perspective, OEMs would finally need to stand up more clearly for their customers. A driver could set criteria, for example, drive to Copenhagen, maximum 45 cents per kilowatt hour, no more than 5 minutes off the road. Or drive to Oslo, show only charging points above 200 kilowatts, maximum 55 cents with restroom facilities. The car would then generate a request and providers could respond in near real time via a bidding process. In the end, either the driver decides or the system selects based on his given preferences. Such settings could be stored permanently, so there is no additional effort. An unrealistic request would simply receive no offers. But the result would be true choice, not forced path. Not the lowest price at any cost, but fair offers that are transparent and justifiable. Because providers need to cover their costs and make money, otherwise the business model will not work. But they must make prices transparent and explain them with performance, because only then trust may emerge again. Apps would still have their place in this scenario, but only if they provide real added value. For example, through reservation functions, availability, route planning, detailed charging histories, you name it. The potential is significant and could support new business models. But to achieve this, providers would have to invest rather than simply monetizing existing structures, as it is often the case today. Apps would then no longer be necessarily a forced channel, but a voluntary extension of my charging experience. This could create a market that, in my view, takes up Tesla's strengths and expands it. Not only integration and convenience, but also greater choice. It would be a system where fairness, economic viability and transparency come together, and where decisions are no longer based on the brand of the charger or the card in your wallet, but on whether individual requirements and needs are actually met. At the end of this ride through the Wild West of charging, one key insight stands out for me. We as customers are the only ones who truly have an interest in seeing change. From what I observe, most market participants pursue other goals: higher margin, larger market share, and as much control over the customer as possible. When they say they act in the interest of the customers, they usually mean in the interest of customer retention. That's why we should not plug in anywhere without thinking, but instead compare, check, and use alternatives. We don't have to accept every tariff. There are options, even if they are less convenient. But convenience must not become a free pass for a login. And if prices, tariffs, or a lack of transparency bother us, we need to say so to the manufacturers, to the providers, and within the community. The same applies to car purchase. We need to look more closely and draw consequences if we are restricted too much. This is not about chasing the last cent. Price differences are fine as long as they are transparent and justifiable through real added value or location advantages. The decisive factor is removing the information asymmetry, because it directly creates the feeling of being taken for a ride. This is why we need transparency and choice. Intermediaries are only acceptable as long as they deliver real added value, not if they simply insert themselves in the chain. Every market begins with us, the customer, and ends with us. Where there is no demand, no amount of supply matters. But as long as we go along, nothing changes. Only when we demand transparency and avoid unfair practices, pressure will build up on the suppliers. Every charging session is a vote with a charging cable. No company ultimately has as much power as the sum of our charging decisions. The economist Thomas Sowell once said, "The reason so many people misunderstand so many issues is not that these issues are so complex, but that people do not want a factual or analytical explanation that leaves them emotionally unsatisfied. They want villains to hate and heroes to cheer, and they don't want explanations that do not give them that." I don't share his very market-driven worldview in every respect, but this point hits the mark. We see it not only in charging, maybe even in this video, but in the wider e-mobility debate. The issues are not too complex. They can be explained and understood rationally. Yet instead of engaging with the real mechanisms, we often prefer to look for heroes and villains. But to act effectively in our own interest, we need facts, understanding, and transparency. Only with that foundation, we weigh trade-offs and make sound decisions. With that in mind, stay full of energy. And if you feel better informed after this video, I appreciate a thumbs up, a subscription, and your support. You will find options in the video description below. And of course, post your questions in the comments. And then we see each other in the next video.